Hey everyone, this is Thomas for Springfield Daily. We are in the incubator in downtown Springfield with Betsy Dirksen Londrigan. Londrigan is the Democratic candidate in the 13th Congressional District running against Republican incumbent Rodney Davis. You're our first repeat guest, so thank you so much for being here again. And before we get into the meat of the issues, tell us a little bit about yourself and why are you running for Congress?
Sure. Well, first of all, it's my pleasure, and I love the new space. I think it's great. I'm happy to be back. So, I'm born and raised right here in Springfield. I went to school at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, and I taught middle school for a couple of years after that before moving back home. And my husband Tom and I have raised our 3 kids here, and it's just, I'm a hometown girl, and I love Central Illinois. I love our community, and I am in this race because I want a voice out in Washington, D.C. that represents Central Illinois, and I don't feel we have it. And my tipping point, of course, for getting into the race was healthcare. And as I move around the district, I've put well over 50,000 miles on my car getting around the district and listening to people. And I can tell you that healthcare is overarchingly the number one issue that people talk to me about.
All right, and so we'll definitely get to that. But first, since the last time you were on the show, you were running in a very contested primary, a lot of strong candidates there. What do you find is different about running in the general election against just one other party opponent compared with running in a primary just for your own base?
Sure. Well, first of all, let me say that we did have a very intense primary, and I am pleased that Eric, John, and David immediately following the primary jumped on board and are 100% on Team Betsy. I talked to them, I talked to each of them, and they are very supportive. In fact, they are hosting events for me, and they've encouraged their volunteers to come over to our campaign. They have been wonderful. And I think that solidarity is important to note, that we're all together in this.
All right, and I know you've been, you mentioned the 50,000 miles. I know you've been hosting a lot of town halls, a lot of roundtables. You mentioned healthcare is the big issue. What are people saying about that? Because I know there's been Obamacare and now Trump Care. What are people concerned about?
Sure. Well, let me start with the town halls, because we just finished our 7th, and we have 14 on the calendar. Well, 14 total on the calendar. We just finished our 7th. We're doing one in every county, and they are all free and open to the public, and I love it. It's a great opportunity to listen to people and have conversations. And people are very concerned because of what the GOP in Congress has been trying to do, and that is to threaten health care. And now we're looking at rolling back coverage for people with pre-existing conditions. And they're looking at making cuts to Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. Health care it crosses party lines. And I can tell you, as I move around the district, that pre-existing conditions don't pick political parties. And when we are talking about the cost of prescription drugs, the pharmacist isn't asking you which ballot you pull. It affects Republicans and Democrats and independents all the same. So these are huge issues for everybody in the district.
All right, and before we get, if we get away from the town halls, has anything surprised you at the town halls? Has anything sort of been a much bigger issue than you expected, or maybe something you thought people were going to come out and talk about, and really didn't make the cut for people? Has anything been unusual?
We did, I think, 21 forums during the primary with all the candidates. And that's not including the town halls and the meetings that I did separately. And so I have been in constant communication and contact with voters from day one. So this really is an extension of that. And I think the reason that our message our message resonates with voters is because it's driven by voters, and it has been from the beginning.
All right, and just on the campaign, one last sort of unpleasant question. There was that unpleasant business last week where you were harassed at a fundraiser event by someone who worked past tense for your opponent. Do you have anything more you want to say about that? Sort of explain what happened there? I mean, that's not what we want to see in this district, but anything to add to the story so far?
Well, I would say that, first of all, it was way beyond unpleasant. It was completely unnecessary. And it's the exact type of nasty political tactics that people don't want to see. It does nothing to move our issues forward. And him becoming physical with both me and my husband, and then really physically aggressive with the people outside, is ridiculous. And that was his intent. His intent was to provoke or incite, and it just doesn't need to be that way. And I think that anybody who says, well, that's just politics, is wrong, because I have been on the campaign trail meeting with voters for well over a year. That has never happened. That is somebody who came to our event with the intent on causing a problem, and he did. It's just that the problem ended up his.
I mean, and to get off the unpleasantness, something a little bit more fun then.
Yeah.
You know, the one sort of fun issue with Trump is the Spaceforce. I was super excited about that. Is that a national priority right now?
Well, let me put this. I think it sounds fun and interesting, but the reality is that he wants to create an entirely new bureaucracy that'll cost billions of dollars. I think the reality of that is less fun. And I want to see us use that fund to help people who are in serious need. You know, we have serious concerns with our healthcare system and our education systems. And there are real Americans that every day are facing crises, and that's where I'd like to see those funds go.
All right, and of course, funds were the major issue. You know, government spending was the issue with the new tax bill, and I know you mentioned that was something that's come up a lot at the town halls and with your constituents. I know we talked about that before, but sort of, has anything changed with that? What's the major issue there?
That it's not for people in the middle class. It's not for people in the 13th district. That tax scam, those benefits went to corporations and super wealthy people and special interests. And people in the 13th district know it. And they are upset about it because they believe, like I believe, that you grow economies from the middle class out, and trickle down doesn't work. We know it doesn't work. So stop telling us it's going to work, because it doesn't.
Yeah, well, and what about I know there's the pass-through income, because a lot of small businesses are the S-corps, the LLCs, and the proprietorships that did get a tax cut there. But does that benefit offset, you know, for of course the very, very large companies? It
doesn't offset it. That is one step in the right direction. And some of the things that have been maybe steps in the right direction that are, you know, that have sunset clauses or are phased out. You know, there needs to be real tax reform with permanent solutions for the middle class and for small business owners.
Yeah, and so, I mean, obviously the tax cuts for the small businesses are good, but you talked about real lasting reform, because the hang up in the Senate, as I understand it, was the fact that the deficit didn't balance with this. And so how do you deal with the fact that we're running a structural deficit and still do that tax reform?
Well, what they have done right now is they have blown our debt sky high. So sky high that the Spaceforce is going to have to address it at some point, I imagine. But we've got to, you know, we have to reprioritize, and that the deficit that they have added to cannot be balanced by cutting Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. We can't do that, and that's, you know, I think it demonstrates the priorities of the GOP and Congress, that they are there to provide benefits to special interests and corporations and super wealthy people. And I'm standing up and saying, you are not balancing that budget on the backs of our elderly, our children, or our sick.
All right, and again, thinking of groups that are being hit, tariffs have been a major issue for this district, of course, with the steel workers being happy, but of course the farmers being very, very concerned about the budding trade war with China. I mean, what's the right track there?
The right track is not picking a trade war with China when they're our third largest trading partner. And so what we have to do is we have to address the issues that this administration has created with the markets. And right now, since March, our soybean farmers have seen their crop prices reduced by 25%. That's devastating to small farmers. And what he is doing with this bailout, it's nothing more than a Band-Aid on a self-inflicted wound. And the farmers don't want a bailout. They want markets to sell to.
All right, but what would you say to the critics? I mean, Rodney Davis has said repeatedly that China is not a good actor on the trading scale. How do we deal with the fact that China is doing some things, or people believe strongly China is doing things that aren't in the spirit of free trade, fair trade with the United States? Well,
and I think that we saw that addressed with steel, and that had to be addressed because they have been dumping steel. And so we did see that addressed, and then it went a bridge too far, and then it just spun out of control. So there are steps that we can take and that we want our administration and our government to take to slow down and to put a stop to some of the unfair trade practices that we know that China has engaged in. That doesn't mean that we need to do it at the cost of our agricultural community.
And so, I mean, from everything you said, I assume you don't support the trade war with Canada or the EU that's also spun out of this conflict.
No, absolutely not. I mean, that was ridiculous, and it speaks to the sort of chaos that this administration creates, where they work against our allies, and Canada and the EU have been consistent, trustworthy trade partners and allies for a long time. And I think that they deserve, more respect than what we've been giving them.
Although, and while we're talking about the EU, though, there are criticisms that EU members, NATO members, aren't meeting their defense obligations, and so this was seen as a tactic to force them to provide for their own defense. But again, is this the right way to do that?
I am a diplomacy first believer. And I believe that when it comes to people who have stood with you through the test of time, that forcing them by slapping tariffs on them is not a good approach.
All right, and one last Trump-specific question. Some Democratic candidates have said that they are automatic votes for impeachment, but in the latest town hall, one of the Jacksonville town hall, rather, that Rodriguez was in just over on the 18th, he said that he would not be an automatic vote, and he would wait to see all the evidence. Where do you fall on the impeachment question?
Listen, I have faith in our Justice Department. I really do. And I want to see this investigation play out fully. And I want to wait and see what Mueller comes back with, because to me, it's not about one person. This is the office of the presidency. And I want to make sure that the Justice Department has the time and the resources to make sure that they fully investigate it.
All right, and thinking of the Justice Department and justice issues, ICE has been in the news a lot, immigration reform, immigration problems. Yeah. What do you want to say about ICE? What do you want to say about the current state of immigration?
That I do not believe in abolishing ICE. I do believe in reform, and clearly we need reform, but that reform has to be comprehensive. We have to have effective border security, and we also need a fair and humane path to citizenship. And these are things that we can accomplish together. All
right, and to get away from that issue for a minute, you've talked about your experience as a small business owner. You self-described entrepreneur, and I know you've held roundtables even here in Springfield to help understand the business climate. What has sort of been the takeaways from those, and what does Washington need to do to help the business ecosystem in the country, but also in the 13th?
Well, I think that making small business loans easier, to navigate and to procure would be a really positive move for small business owners. Here in the 13th, we have some special challenges because we still face a digital divide. And if we really want, people in the 13th district to be able to compete in this digital world, then we have to make sure that there is the infrastructure in place so that everyone benefits from broadband and from being connected. And we don't have that yet. And so, that's a pretty special concern. And then, it does go back to our overarching issue of making sure that we protect healthcare. Protecting it also means expanding it to people who it's being priced so high that they can't afford it. There are a lot of small business owners that I hear from who would love to be able to provide it for their employees, but it's too expensive because they're in small communities and some of the providers have pulled out, and they would love to see a public option. Medicare is a public option, which is something that I've talked about, available to them.
Right, and I guess what does that mean, public option for Medicare? Can you explain that to people a little bit more?
Sure. So it means, the way that I've looked at it is to look at opening it up as a public option geographically. And so essentially it brings competition into the market. So people are paying premiums, but by bringing more competition into the market, then it can drive costs down. And so we know that Medicare is smaller communities, the infrastructure is already in place. And this is just opening it up in a different way that people in rural or smaller communities and small business owners could buy into it.
All right, and you talked about the broadband divide. Back in the 1930s, there was a big push for rural electrification, where the government just said, we are going to make sure everybody has electricity. Yeah. Would you be in favor of something where the government did something similar, saying everybody's going to have high-speed internet in this country?
Yes, that's what we're trying to work toward. We can't leave our rural communities behind, and that's what's happening, is that we have students and small business owners who can't move forward the way they need to move forward because they are still faced by this wall of a digital divide.
All right, and of course thinking of the digital divide, the internet is from Champaign-Urbana, these great schools we have in the 13th, and of course this is the season for that. You just sent someone off to school, and of course other students at UIS. I'll be attending there this fall. And paying for college is the big issue. Yeah. College is extremely expensive, and there's a huge student loan problem in this country.
There is.
What do you see as sort of driving that problem, and then how does the government address it? What's the government's role there?
Well, first of all, we need to get the interest on loans for students under control, and the ability to refinance. These are things the government can do. We can also encourage employers to provide student loan repayment as a benefit. We can incentivize that. We can incentivize lifting the caps on some of the employer contribution towards student loan repayment. So there are things that we can do on the government side. I also think it's really important that we start addressing verbally and proudly that there are so many great options for students, including vocational schools and apprenticeships and 2-year programs. These are conversations we need to have because we have a need in this country, and some of that need is not being met, and it can be. And it can also help students not graduate from a 4-year university or 2-year university with, saddled in debt.
One of the issues I've heard about them making the employer contributions towards paying student loans. Mm-hmm. One concern that I've heard about that, though, is that might have a suppressing effect on wages, where yes, your total compensation is higher, but that might encourage employers to underpay their employees. Instead of raising their wages an extra $2,000, the company gets a tax credit for $2,000, which is functionally the same, but it has a suppressing effect on wages. I don't know if that's
No, and I think that's probably why the government needs to be involved to make sure that doesn't happen.
All right, and some people have said that the government providing loans, the government loan programs, yes, they provide more money to people, but they actually cause the price to go up because they allow colleges to raise their prices. How do we rein in the cost side on the colleges? What's the government's role there? Well,
one program that I've talked about, across the district is looking. It's outside the box. It's looking at income share agreement programs, and how can we, as the federal government, help move some of those forward, where students on the front end don't have all of the costs of college, but they do have skin in the game, because on the back end they are contracted to give a certain percentage of their income for a certain number of years back to the school. And it really aligns the interests of the college and the student, because then the college has a vested interest in making sure that that student is, is successful in school and job ready, and it helps with, and it encourages placement. And so I think that we're going to have to be creative here, because we've got to break down these barriers to students getting educations.
Yeah, and having skin in the game, for-profit colleges have come under a lot of scrutiny recently. Yes, they're providing more options for people, but some people see them as being sort of exploitive. And the government has cracked down on several bad actors in that field. Is the government doing enough there to make sure that people aren't being taken advantage of?
Well, no, we have to do more. And I think that what they're trying to do, what the Secretary of Education is trying to do by loosening some of those rules is horrible, because they're taking advantage of people. They're taking advantage of our veterans. They're taking advantage of young students, and it's just simply wrong.
All right, and I know we're running a little short on time, so is there going to be, I know you've hosted a lot of events on your own, and Ronnie Davis has had some events of his own. Is there going to be a debate between the two of you, or a set of debates between the two of you?
I think that we've got one on the calendar. I think the SJR forum is on October 15th, and I will continue to meet with voters. I will continue to do town halls. I think that it's such an important aspect of being a representative. I want the job, right? And being a representative means that you have to listen to people, whether they agree with you, disagree with you. You're asking to represent all of them, and you should be willing to do that.
All right, and finally, midterms generally have a lot, like primaries, midterm elections have a lot lower turnout, in part because the president's not on the ballot. So why do people need to come out? What's at stake in November? Not just your seat, but sort of larger than just who's in Congress. What does this midterm mean?
I don't think there's ever been a more important election than November 6th of 2018. And I'll tell you, as I listen to voters who are upset with the climate of politics and upset with the direction our nation is going, upset with the costs of their health care, upset with, they're watching CEOs of corporations get huge bonuses. Meanwhile, they're not getting anything in their paycheck. The only solution I see on the horizon is November 6th, flipping the House and bringing some checks and balances to Congress.
All right. So our guest today was Betsy Dirksen Londrigan, the Democrat in the 13th District. Again, thank you so much for being here.
It's always a pleasure, Thomas. Happy to do it.
Thank you so much for being here. And this has been Thomas Clatterbuck for Springfield Daily.